Hello everybody, hopefully this is working properly. My camera keeps playing up part of my suffering. So this is what this show is going to be about. It's suffering and sacrifice. And hopefully my computer will keep working all the way through this show and the camera will not sacrifice itself. Anyway, suffering is very important in the Gurdjieff work. He talks about suffering a lot, Gurdjieff does, and how most people enjoy their suffering. People like to be full of woe, full of suffering. It's something for them to moan about, and for some reason, it keeps people alive. It makes them want to go and talk about it to everybody else and feel sorry for themselves. Where if they could just let go of their suffering and actually learn to live, then see, I have suffering going now. Now an alarm's going. It's been really difficult to try and record this show. I've had a few attempts. I might just persevere. Oh, it stopped. People love their suffering, is what Gurdjieff says. And I kind of realised that over the years as I've been studying people. And I realised myself, I was a bit like that when I was younger. The old woe is me, thinking if people were feeling sorry for me, they might, I don't know, are we stealing their energy? When I've looked at this in different new age, I suppose, spiritual psychotherapy, they call it vampirism. People are stealing your energy when you're trying to make people feel sorry for yourself. But why do we suffer? What is all this suffering about? Well, Gurdjieff says it's an important part of the work because with our suffering, when we become aware of it, we can turn it around and make use of it. And Ouspensky says in Search of Miraculous, page 156, about the work, a man must agree to this work, realizing that the result of his work will be every possible discomfort and suffering from the awakening of his conscience. And when we start working on ourselves, as I've said before in other shows, and as Gurdjieff says in his writings, we suddenly become aware of the things we've done in the past, the way we felt, the way we've looked at things, and we cringe. We suffer with all that feeling of, oh God, how awful I was. Well, we need to turn that suffering around. And, you know, the more we become awake and aware of what it is that we're doing that's so awful or that causes discomfort in ourselves when we're trying to wake up, you know, that's our ego trying to make us feel better when it's doing the old suffering or being horrible to other people or horrible to other things or gone out for things for egotistic things, reasons. All this suffering, we all know there's so many different versions. I can't really go into the list because it's so much of it. We all suffer. Everyone's suffering. We see other creatures suffering. We see other humans suffering, and we suffer ourselves. As the old saying is, you know, be kind to everybody because everybody's carrying a burden. Well, with this Gurdjieff work, we're becoming aware of what our burden is, and instead of making it weigh us down, oh, poor old me, woe is me, we accept what that burden is, we look at it, and once we've started doing the work, we can see what is causing that burden or how we can release from it or how we can recognize it, we can observe it and see it in a different way of how it's holding us back. So suffering can be used in the work to help us. Obviously, we see other people suffering as well and how people want to use that suffering against us sometimes to make us feel sorry for them or to make us, you know, emotional blackmail against us or whatever. We have to be aware of what's going on and why people are doing that. And again, it's back to looking at the cause of what's causing someone their suffering. And in Gurdjieff's priory in France, where he had in the big tent all the aphorisms written around in his special alphabet around the walls, there was one very important one. Only conscious suffering has any sense. And it's conscious suffering when we're aware of what we're going through and what we're doing, and we suffer from how difficult it is to wake up, and we're suffering from what we're seeing has happened to us before, and how we don't want to be like that in the future. And if we're doing it in a conscious state, it will help us. It becomes a different energy and makes us see things in a different way. Right, so I'm going to do some views from the real world. Let me pick. Oh, actually, I wanted to do from all and everything first. So even Gurdjieff suffers, of course. He's suffering to put this work across to us so that we can all understand what the work is. And he writes in All and Everything on page 1185 about the first chapter that he wrote. That first chapter, about which I thought deeply from every aspect, and which I experienced under the most exclusive action of my own willed self-mortification. He had to really strip himself down to write that chapter, to write them books, to do all this work. You know, he really worked for himself throughout his life. It's an ongoing task all the time. But if we can do all this consciously, then we really see what we are and make no excuses for what we do and how we are and what our suffering is, but actually take it on board. And he says about turning that suffering around to be a benefit for us. And when you start understanding why you're suffering or what that suffering is, things start becoming clearer in yourself. You begin to understand what it is. You get back to the core again of, well, why did I feel that way? Or why did I do that? What was causing me to create this suffering? And when you start recognizing what your actions are and your patterns are, this is all part of the stopping the mechanization of the automaton. We don't want to be like that. We want to be awake instead. So I'm going to do some views from the real world quotes because I found loads about it in there. So page 40. You wish to know why we are born and why we die, which should be an important question. Everybody should be thinking this, not even people in the work. Just, you know, we need to look at this question and try and figure it out. And most people, you know, they might have a little moment's thought of it in their life and then they forget about it or ignore it because it is a challenging question. You wish to know why we are born and why we die. To really know, you must suffer. You must learn to suffer not as you do now, but consciously. At present, you cannot suffer for 1 franc, and to know, to understand a little, you must suffer for 1,000,000 francs. You know, and Gurdjieff used to put a lot of money, talking about money, of how much his work costs to be taught it. But it doesn't necessarily mean just money, and obviously we can't pay Mr. Gurdjieff ourselves because he's not here with us in the physical world. But he's using money as an analogy for how much effort you put in. Are you putting in 1 franc's worth of effort? Are you putting in 1,000,000 francs worth of effort on your work, of yourself, of developing yourself? Again, it's the quality, not the quantity, that we're putting into here. The quality of that effort you're putting in. You know, you could do it all day, and if you're only doing it half-heartedly, that's nothing compared to doing it for 5 minutes and really fully conscious of what you are doing. 100%, 110% effort into it. So views from the real world, page 98. Education of the horse needs time, needs suffering. Between the positive and negative principles, there must be friction, suffering. Suffering leads to the 3rd principle. Remember, wholly affirming, wholly denying, wholly reconciling, transubstantiating me for my being. Suffering leads to the 3rd principle. It is 100 times easier to be passive so that suffering and results happen outside and not inside you. We want it to be happening inside you as well, because that's where all the energy is being created to help develop your bodies and yourself and to harmonize your centers so that you can reach them higher centers. So views from the real world, page 84. There are 2 kinds of suffering, conscious and unconscious. Only a fool suffers unconsciously, and I was talking about that just now. How much effort are you putting into the effort? How conscious are you? How consciously aware are you of what you are doing? And I did a show recently, I think it was the last one, about the 2 rivers. And here's a little 2 rivers quote from Views from the Real World, page 85. In the first river, suffering is completely useless because it is accidental and unconscious. In this other river, there is a different kind of suffering. Today, the drop suffers because yesterday, it did not suffer enough. Here, the law of retribution operates. Only voluntary suffering has value. One may suffer simply because one feels unhappy, or one may suffer for yesterday and to prepare for tomorrow. Even though we should be living in the now, but we're doing this work over time. So views from the real world, page 100. We suffer whenever we are not mechanically quiet. There are different kinds of suffering. For instance, I want to tell you something, but I feel it is best to say nothing. One side wants to tell, the other wants to keep silent. The struggle produces a substance. Gradually, this substance collects in a certain place. So what is that certain place? That certain place should be inside you, collecting all the energies together to help develop the bodies that we need to develop into, for our soul to go into when our Keshan body develops, and also to develop our bodies for living in this life, in this world. If you try to do something you don't want to do, you will suffer. If you want to do something and don't do it, you also suffer. If you suffer with one center, either thinking or feeling, you get to a lunatic asylum. Suffering must be harmonious. And he goes on to talk about how emotion and suffering is fire. And in the spiritual teachings, the ancient wisdoms, fire is the power, the overall power over earth, air, water, spirit, whatever. Fire, especially the ancient fire or the fire of wisdom, is what lights up ourselves, lights up the energies in us, lights up everything we've learned, lights up our body. We want to be carrying that candle of wisdom inside us, that candle of learning, that candle of love and light, that candle of development, and not have it distinguished by the dark side, or have it distinguished by our suffering of, we're not worthy of all this. Sometimes that's the suffering that comes through, telling you you're not worthy, that little voice, when you are worthy, because you're on this path. So you've obviously got the opportunity to do this because you're questioning everything. Page 247, views from the real world. Only intense suffering or shock pierces the crust, and then conscience speaks. So it's like that suffering breaks through, helps open us up to what we really need to listen to, our conscience, that divine spark to the God, to his endlessness, that link. And now we have the two sticks, which Gurdjieff talks about lots. So from views from the real world is page 250. He talks about this a lot as well. Suffering can be of very different kinds, a stick with two ends. One leads to the angel, one to the devil. One must remember the swing of the pendulum, and after great suffering there is proportionately a great reaction. By the side of every good road runs a corresponding bad one. It is easy to find oneself on the wrong road. Suffering easily becomes pleasurable. And it does, even though we pretend we don't like suffering, but people do live for their suffering and enjoy it and get a kick out of it, and it keeps them alive for some reason. Rather, they can't seem to understand that if they lived a more harmonious life, they would live a much more satisfying life or satisfactory life. But I'm sure you're all aware of it. You can see how the world and our peers, how everyone's driven to live their lives through the rat race and, be full of problems. Nothing's ever easy. You need to have this, keeping up with the Joneses, which we shouldn't be doing. Don't want to keep up with the Joneses. But all this kind of thing leads to suffering. And people think it's what's supposed to be happening. They believe this is part of the process of living. But it's the wrong kind of suffering, because it's suffering for materialistic gains or just living an ordinary life that's asleep. We want to live in a life that's awake. So it's a different kind of suffering we're aiming for, the suffering of trying to understand what life is really about, what is really going on, what is the answers to why are we alive, why do we die, why are we born, why do we die. It's a different quality of suffering. It's more esoteric, important questions that are deeper than just the everyday suffering of, oh, what's happened, why don't my neighbors like me, or why are my neighbors doing better than I, or why is my partner not treating me like I should be? Why have I got these ills? And most people have ills because they're not happy in their lives, like physical ills, being ill. We want the suffering of, why don't I understand what's going on with life? But it's a different, again, you need to read these books, as I've said before, and many of these go to the core teachings. Read Gurdjieff, read Ouspensky, read Knott's books and all that, so that you can get a better understanding of what it is I'm trying to say. I'm not very good at explaining all this, which is why I use the quotes from the books. So I wanted to do some all and everything. Page 59 to 60. We must not oppose forces higher than our own, but submit and receive all their results with reverence, praising and glorifying the wonderful and providential works of our Lord Creator. Sometimes our sufferings put on us to help us develop. But we should be thankful for everything in life, everything that happens to us at the end of the day or at that time or whenever it's convenient to you. We should be thanking Divine for what's been given to us, thanking Him for the day and the night, or her, whatever, your God, Goddess. His endlessness in Gurdjieff's work. So we've got page 241, all and everything. One of the best means of rendering ineffective the predisposition present in your nature, of the crystallization of the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, is intentional suffering. And the greatest intentional suffering can be obtained in your presences if you compel yourselves to be able to endure the displeasing manifestations of others towards yourself. Oh God, that's hard work, isn't it? People can be annoying, but then I'm sure I'm annoying to other people. We've got to learn to endure how people treat us and what they do that irritates us. All these kinds of sufferings, we've got to stop noticing how we're feeling when people do things, or how we're feeling when people react towards us or are trying to get their own way through us, use us, blah blah blah. We've got to do some human psychology, psychoanalysis, looking at people of what are their ends, what are their means, what are they after. And earlier I was talking about the two sticks, the stick with two ends rather, devil on one side, the angel on the other. Everybody's got them. So it's whether people are listening to their little devil chatting away to them or their little angel chatting away to them. And it's the same for you. What are we going towards, the devil or the angel? And as Gurdjieff says, we should really be heading towards the angel. But if we're going towards the devil, use all that work that we do with the devil to develop ourselves. So all and everything, page 372. Owing to the data crystallized in our common presences for engendering in us the divine impulse of conscience, the whole of our essence are and must be already in our foundation, only suffering because the completed actualizing of the manifestation of such a being impulse can proceed only from the constant struggle of two quite opposite sources, namely between the process of the functioning of the planetary body itself and the parallel functionings arising progressively from the coating and perfecting of our higher being bodies, which actualize every kind of reason. And when this process is going on in us, this is all that friction's being created, and Gurdjieff says we use that friction creates all the energy and improves the quality. The more we do this kind of thing, sorry, excuse me, talking my throat, we need the friction to make the action. It's kind of like with friction with electromagnetics, when it's got the friction going, when something's going to make the sparks in between it. That's what we're working towards doing. And Gurdjieff reminds us that we all have unhappy moments. Every real happiness for man can arise exclusively only from some unhappiness, also real, which he has already experienced. And there is a difference between having real feelings and imagined feelings. Again, we use imagination for the wrong things most of the time, and we think up or daydream how things are going to happen to us, when we should be using imagination for work way, or I was about to say contemplating the gods, visualize gods, talking to them or whatever. But imagination where we're making things difficult for ourselves puts us in certain moods. And I'll do one example. You might be sitting there thinking about an argument you had with your friend, and then you start imagining how you would have done it better, or imagining how you're going to go to that friend and tell them what you think, and you're in a bad mood about it, and you're going to give them everything, perhaps even beat them up. Well, that kind of imagination thought, even thinking about it, is creating certain energies inside you which are not very good, because they're angry, negative energies. And again, we're all coming back to the right thought creates better quality inside yourself. So we've got, that's again a suffering where we've got to learn to stop that kind of thought. And we suffer when we're thinking things like that, and we're suffering when we're trying to stop it and instead think of it in a different way. But it will create a better quality energy when we've done it, when we've turned that negative round to a positive. Instead, we should be thinking in that instance about how we're going to make amends with that friend that you've had the argument with, and thinking a positive way of how you're going to be constructive and offer it, the palm leaf of, friendship. I would like to make amends, that kind of thing. We want them, that kind of thoughts, not nasty thoughts. So, and he's going to use Mullah Nasir ad-Din as an example. Good old Mullah Nasir ad-Din, who turns up in lots of pages of all and everything, giving well, not advice, he kind of has sentences that explain how ridiculous some of the things are that we do. He's a great character. Never will he understand the suffering of another who has not experienced them himself, though he may have divine reason and the nature of a genuine devil. And this is one of Mullah Nasir ad-Din's sayings, which is true. We might have divine reason, we might know what's right and wrong, but that nature of the devil in us pushes us to do just that little thing that's perhaps the wrong way. And Gurdjieff goes on to say that his books are about explaining the difference between voluntary and intentional suffering. Voluntary suffering and intentional suffering, two different types of suffering that we all put ourselves through. But the intentional suffering is the one that will help us to develop. He discusses that kind of thing in Life is Real, Only Then When I Am quite deeply, but it's in a lot of his books. Right, so I was going to finish with this one from, oh, where's it gone? I just lost the page. Right, so this is from In Search of the Miraculous. When he begins to work on himself, a man must sacrifice his own decisions, because otherwise the will of the man who directs his will not be able to control his actions. And remember, we've got many eyes in us, and we're trying to collect all them eyes together under the direction of Deputy Steward, who will then let Real Eye come through. And if we could get Real Eye to direct us, that's a good thing. We're on our path. Schools of the fourth way demand understanding before anything else. Consciousness of one's own nothingness alone can conquer the fear of subordination to the will of another. Oh, the subordinating ourselves to the will of another, that's another big suffering thing. And many people do that because they don't have the strength to be themselves, so they do what other people tell them to do, even though at the time they're also thinking, oh, if only I could be the real me. Or maybe they don't realize they're like that, I don't know. I'm quite lucky that I've always been a bit of a rebel and don't really like people telling me what to do, but there are people out there that tell people what to do in a bullying way, and because they enjoy being in control. And we can't control anything, nothing can be controlled. The world is chaotic, but people all the time are trying to get control of their lives and everybody else's, because if they can control everybody else's, then their life will run how they want it to, or so they think. Very rarely works. Right then, so Ouspensky said, man must sacrifice his suffering. In a quite superstitious way, man expects to gain something by sacrificing his pleasure, but he cannot expect anything for sacrifice of his suffering. Many sufferings from which man cannot get rid, many others based on imagination, which he cannot and will not give up, like the idea of injustice and the belief in the possibility of destroying injustice. Besides, many people have nothing but negative emotions. The struggle against negative emotions is a part of school training. And I do understand why people want to sort out injustice. We all want to live in a more fair and just world, but that will come down to everybody waking up. Because when people aren't awake and they're not following their conscience or their consciousness, they're going to do what they can, what they will, try and, jump queues, try to take shortcuts, which, let's say here is the unjust way, rather than being part of the order that's going along. And we see injustice all the time. We read it in the newspapers, we see it on our Yahoo feeds, or whatever you get your news from. You hear it on the radio, and news likes to sell shock stories and likes to put us all into, be upset for somebody else's suffering, another way to drain our energy, but at the same time keeps us subordinate to their way of thinking, of that we must live in this world of fear because everything's bad, everything's rotten, and everything's unjust. And we should believe in our leaders that are trying to make it a more justified world and making their justice system work for us. Well, most of us know the justice system doesn't work because it's corrupt. But that's because people are asleep. We haven't got awake people in charge. And there's not enough of us to wake the rest of the world up. And those that aren't awake and that are looking for shortcuts or following a criminal type of way of living, or do things for themselves and without any concern of how they're harming others, that's probably because they've had a pretty rubbish life themselves and not had a fair chance at everything. We have to look at why people have turned out how they are, which is again hard work, because we don't want to believe that some people have been through such horrendous things, which is why they've turned out to say, but this is all part of the suffering that we need to help each other and help ourselves with. So I was going to finish with, well, Ouspensky again. Man must sacrifice his suffering. In a quite superstitious way, man expects to gain something by sacrificing his pleasure. But he cannot expect anything for sacrifice of his suffering. Many sufferings from which man cannot get rid, many others based on imagination which he cannot and will not give up, like the idea of injustice and the belief in the possibility of destroying injustice. Besides, many people have nothing but negative emotions. The struggle against negative emotions is a part of school training. Sorry, I made you suffer through that quote again. I haven't read that twice, but hey, that's part of suffering. Maybe I should leave it there. I'll just do one. Oh, yes, one from J.G. Bennett, John Godolphin Bennett. Fantastic quote from him. And I didn't write down what book I got this from. I do apologize. So Mr. Bennett says, Gurdjieff always emphasized the obligation we have to serve the future, to prepare a better future for mankind. We must learn to make present sacrifices for the sake of the future. And I have talked to Tony Blake all about J.G. Bennett's talk at the Gotham Bookmark, which was given in the 1970s. It's on my channel. If you go through the videos, you'll find the talk. In fact, I talked to Tony Blake lots about J.G. Bennett, but that show is very important because he goes on there, Mr. Bennett, about why things had to change and are they changing. I'm concerned myself. Mr. Bennett gave it 50 years and he did this in 1970. So this is the important years of, have we been able to change the world for the better, or has it fallen to the dark side? So hope you didn't suffer too much through this show. Please look at the other shows if you can with Tony Blake, because they're very good. Other ways of explaining the Gurdjieff work, and do look up JG Bennett. I need to do more on his quotes, really, because he puts across some fantastic stuff. So thank you all for watching. Thanks for watching the other shows. And until next time, peace.